it was a graduate year. I'd just gotten my MA in English literature, and I'd done a creative emphasis there, which meant that I did my thesis as a short story. So I was sending out short stories to little magazines, trying to get published, and they would come back. And I really wanted to find a way to break into print. And I had become enamored of the new journalism, Tom Wolfe's, Norman Mailer's, Susan Sontag's, Joan Didion's writings, and I saw that as an avenue that I might be able to explore because they were using the same literary techniques that I'd been studying. So, I remember sitting down and thinking about stories that might be of possible interest, and I made a list of subjects that I was interested in. The first, of course, was literature. The second was music because I played guitar. And the third was theatricality in the broad sense of that term. And somehow I knew that I would have to come up with a person who embraced all of those things. And the person who immediately popped into my head was Bob Dylan. So a friend of mine who worked for the Washington Post suggested, he said, why don't you just go out there and see if there's a story? I mean, there was that Newsweek story that was published in the mid-'60s and didn't have much, but see what you can find. So, I thought maybe I would, and I got up the nerve to try to call Bob Dylan's father and called information, and they said that number was canceled, and then I got the name of Zimmerman's Furniture and Electric, where his father had worked, called there, and his uncle answered the phone. It told me that Dylan's father had died a month or two before, and immediately when I heard that, I knew that there was some kind of a news angle there because Dylan would have come home for the funeral. And the uncle said that he would talk to me. That was all I needed. I got in my car, spent a couple of days on the road, came into Hibbing, Minnesota, and as I tell the story in the book, I was listening to this FM radio station from Duluth as I came into Hibbing, and I was driving down the main street, looking at all these buildings where Dylan had spent his life and the sidewalks where he'd walked, and his voice came on the radio, amazingly enough, and it was just like a woman. And I'm looking at all these places from his childhood, and he's singing to me. When we meet again, introduced as friends, please don't let on that you knew me when I was hungry and it was your world. And I thought, wow, this is it, I've got a story. This was the first really big trip I'd taken by myself in a car, going from the East Coast to the deep Midwest. And I was most impressed by how far out in the middle of nowhere Hibbing was. And I went back in 2008 for Dylan Days. I was the writer, and Rambling Jack Elliott was the musician for that weekend of fun in Hibbing. And even in 2008, I was impressed about the degree to which it was still a frontier community. And when Dylan was growing up in the late 1940s and early 1950s, I mean, it basically wasn't that different than the way it was, say, in 1900. When people make fun of Dylan for embracing the folk tradition, they don't realize how close to it he actually was growing up. Part of that was the fact that he was a hometown boy, and a lot of hometown people aren't impressed by local talent, no matter if it's successful or not. The other thing is media. I mean, there's still, in 1968, there still wasn't that much outside media. There were 3 television stations that you could get. There was no cable TV or anything like that. And there were no radio stations that played rock and roll regularly. There was a Hibbing radio station that did, very sort of middle of the road pop stuff, not hardcore rock and roll. There was an FM station that came from Duluth that played, some Dylan. But you still had to sort of stay up late at night to get the big radio stations coming in from Chicago or from the South or from Wheeling, West Virginia that played either rock and roll or country music. So they were isolated. They didn't know any better. And it was still a conservative town in 1968. Dylan was associated with hippiedom, with taking drugs and being against the Vietnam War, all of that stuff that he never really came out and said that he was engaged with, but everybody sort of knew that he was sympathetic to. So that was part of it, was the media presence. The Echo that I got to know was a true free spirit. She was his high school girlfriend during his junior year and up through most of his senior or half of his senior year, I think, if I recall correctly. But more importantly, she was this beautiful Finnish / Swedish heritage young woman who was wild, in a lot of ways wilder than he was. She would wear these leopard skin tights and hitchhike around, and she caught his eye, and I think she brought out the wild side in him. He was this fairly conservative, middle class kid. His family owned one of the big businesses in town. His mother's family owned the movie theaters. He was quiet. He was inarticulate. And he found through performing and through music a way of expressing himself, and socially found through Echo a way to kind of embrace the wilder side of teenage life. And she understood him in a way that the other girls did not understand him, and she brought out this side. There were a couple of reasons for that. Sociologically, they were both outsiders. She was from the wrong side of the tracks. Her father was I think by most accounts, a hard-drinking, working-class guy who could be difficult. He came from a Jewish family in a town and in a region where there had been and was a lot of anti-Semitism, and he was he was the son of a business owner in a working class town where, the miners and other working class people sort of resented people who owned the businesses. So they connected in that way. Well, it's a traveling song in a way. I mean, he says if you're traveling in the North Country Fair, I mean, he's obviously in a place where this person is not. And it's an abstract song, I think. I mean, I don't think Dylan ever really wrote biographically about anybody except, maybe his wife Sarah in Blood on the Tracks and Desire. But, The Girl from the North Country is one of his many, many muse figures. He was influenced by the writings of Robert Graves, who had a theory of poetry called the White Goddess, and the idea there was a muse-based theory. The idea was that if you were a true poet, you paid fealty to a muse, and that muse Graves described as the White Goddess, and she was a very difficult kind of muse, demanding muse. Echo fit that paradigm. She had a mythological name. Echo was the girl that Narcissus fell in love with, but couldn't really be with because he was in love with his own reflection. Talk about perfect metaphors for Dylan. So The Girl from the North Country is an abstract song. If you're traveling in the North Country Fair, it's almost as if you were a troubadour of some kind, a traveling musician hitchhiking from place to place, as Dylan did. And he's remembering those various, very specific things. And the best of Dylan songs have, very specific details. See if her hair still hanging long, if it rolls and flows all down her breast. these very concrete details work. It's also episodic in the sense that it goes from one verse to another with different memories, kind of bringing the camera closer and closer to his longing and sadness at their parting. So that's a quick reading of it, I think. And when you listen to his singing of the song on Freewheeling Bob Dylan, you hear that longing in his voice. I mean, it's really, really heartfelt. Well, I mean, I was up there for the second time, and I'd come up there with Echo. Echo had been showing me around, and I'd been trying to get an interview with her, and she'd been putting me off. And finally, I reached her at work, and she said, "Well, come and have lunch." So I actually put on a coat and tie, which I think really surprised her when I showed up, because she expected some, rough hippie-looking character. And the first most amazing thing about her was the fact that she looked exactly like Bob Dylan. I mean, her face really came out. His face came out of the mold of hers. There's no question about that. And she had this, blonde hair that was about the length of his at that particular time, or at least during the 1966 tours. And it was sitting across from her was just incredible. And she took me to task. I mean, she didn't like the fact that I'd written certain things in my articles, and scolded me a little bit, but then I think quickly settled down and told me some of the most intimate things about Dylan, about his interest in religion, about his home life then in Woodstock, New York, stuff that she never really told any other journalist. I mean, to my knowledge, she only really talked to 3 journalists on the record. Myself, Robert Shelton, and what's his name, who did the book about the Rolling Thunder tour. Anyway, I came away from that with just this feeling like she liked me finally, and that she was this, not to be stereotypical, but she started treating me as if I were like Dylan. And she told me to, finish my dessert, drink my milk, whatever the hell I was eating, and I could see this controlling kind of figure in Dylan's life, disciplined, affectionate, yet had the capacity to be angry and could fly off the handle. I probably like Bob. So there were many things that I took from that interview, and I'm certainly grateful that she gave it to me. I think like most people, that when we heard Freewheeling, when that came out in when was it, 63?
Yeah.
That's where he really started recording his own songs, and they were so great. Blowin' in the Wind was on that, Girl from the North Country. We knew Blowin' in the Wind already from Peter, Paul, and Mary's hit of that song, top 40 hit of that song. And then the other songs were just so good, and his playing was so good, and his voice was so good at that particular point that there was no turning back. I mean, I think that was the album that the Beatles said that they just wore out listening to. It was a worldwide phenomenon, that particular record, and has been pointed out. The record jacket, the cover art itself did not hurt it. I mean, I think Dylan's team very early on marketed him brilliantly, and including that photograph. I mean, there'd never been a photograph of an artist walking down the street with his girlfriend before
in the Village, nonetheless.
In Greenwich, on Great Jones Street in the Village, outside Dylan's 4th Street apartment. I mean, that was a marketing, a stroke of marketing genius. So the romance of the bohemian side of folk music and the sexiness of it was transmitted in that album. I think. Yeah, I think it was the fall of '63 in Philadelphia's Town Hall. I may have that mixed up with. He also played in '64, but I'm pretty sure it was '63, and it was he and his guitar and harmonica. That was it, and he played some songs that hadn't been recorded yet, like the Ballad of Hattie Carroll and Only a Pawn in Their Game, and so it must have been '63, and he just captivated the entire audience, blew them away. I mean, this was a period when he was doing a lot of performing, so his act was extremely tight. His timing was perfect. He just, he played for a couple of hours with an intermission, and just, I mean, blew everybody away. He already had an album out that was that had electric music. I mean, it was not any kind of a shock to me. I think the crowd at Newport by that time. I mean, they'd sort of, it was like a QAnon convention. I mean, they were such true believers that anybody who, in folk music, that anybody who came along and who, stepped outside of that tradition was seen as, an apostate. And so, I mean, they would have booed anybody who got up there and turned what they considered a folk song into rock and roll. I think that Dylan has many facets to his personality, but one of those is that of a really good businessman. And he's engaged people to handle himself and his various products assiduously. I mean, I get every one of his albums. I mean, as soon as it comes out, I listen to it. I'm, either amused or maybe a little bit disappointed. But I mean, the guy's going to be 80 years old, and he's still writing original songs. He's still coming out with albums that go, straight to the top of the charts. Rough and Rowdy Ways, I mean, it was #1 for a while on Billboard. So you got to give the guy, absolute and total credit. And as I said, when I saw him in 2019, I mean, he was like an old guy wandering around the stage. I mean, he had to kind of hold on to the microphone stand to keep from falling over, but he was singing like he was, 26 years old, with his kind of, Louis Armstrong voice that he has now, and playing an upright piano, which I loved that he had brought, rather than the electric piano, he'd brought an actual, old-fashioned upright piano on stage that he mic'd and played. So that was just fantastic. Well, that song, and the part that I liked the best of it, and this is characteristic of Dylan, I think, going all the way back to Mr. Tambourine Man, where these musical figures seem to be the figures that you should follow, or their music is the closest thing to a spiritual connection to the universe in a positive way that one should be aware of. I mean, in Mr. Tambourine Man, he's urging, or he's saying, you're this musician, and I'm going to follow you on this trip. And in Murder Most Foul, I love the way that, after he gets finished with all the speculation about, who killed Kennedy and the descriptions of the day in Dallas and all of that, he comes to the cultural changes that event wrought, and he focuses largely on music and visual art, actually, mostly music. And again, he's sort of saying that here is the salvation. Music is the salvation for him, for most of us. These are the changes that are most significant in our culture, and the ones that are ones that are going to last. So, I love that in other songs on the album. The one about Calliope, I mean, she's the musical muse. Uh, he's constantly looking for Jimmy Reed. The song about Jimmy Reed is basically a song about religion. Give me that old time religion. And for Dylan, that old time religion is the blues, it's music. So, yeah, I mean, he's still being very current and contemporary. I mean, it must have been hard to write that album, because it's the first, I think, original album he produced since winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. So, if that's not a writer's block suggestion there, getting the Nobel Prize for Literature, I don't know, what would be. I have a senior seminar in Bob Dylan, and I teach one every year, either a senior seminar in Dylan or an honors seminar in Dylan, and have been doing that for, I don't know, 12 years or so, I would guess, maybe 15. So yeah, I mean, we're constantly talking about it, and I'm interested in, a lot of these kids don't know about him really at all. Maybe their older brother is named Dylan or something, not after Bob, but, somebody, because it's become such a common name, but, they're interested obviously in popular music, and they become interested in him as a progenitor of current music, and also as somebody. I find that the college-age students are less interested in the later kind of surrealistic works as they are in the ones that Dylan wrote when he was kind of their age. The first maybe 3 albums or so. The love songs there, the personal songs there are the ones that they relate most to because they are that age. It's a young book. I mean, I was heavily under the influence of Tom Wolfe and other stylists of that generation. I'd come out of a year studying contemporary world literature at the University of Virginia. I was into experimentation. I wanted to see what I could get away with, and I knew that if I could trick the reader into starting off reading by being interested in Bob Dylan and have them become more interested in me by the end of the book than in actually Dylan, then I would have done my job. And in a small way, it kind of anticipated the 80s and 90s memoir craze, because the book really is a memoir. It's a memoir of these 2 trips that I took out to Hibbing, Minnesota, and my life and Dylan's life. So in that way, despite its youthfulness, it still engages young people. My students are reading it right now. I'm getting feedback from them. It's not just brown-nosing to the professor, but they get excited by the idea of getting out on the road and looking for your hero's roots and all that kind of thing. And I still get letters from people all over the world who have read it. I think it's really impressive. I love Chronicles, and it just I was listening to Theme Time Radio Hour right before we came on, and I was just reminded of all the things that this guy does. He does painting, he does metal sculpture, an extraordinary metal sculpture. I wrote an article about that in recent years. There just doesn't seem to be a thing that this guy can't do. And writing prose in Chronicles, I think, is an example of that. I mean, I think the first 100 pages or so, the first 2 chapters where he's talking about coming to New York as a young man, those pages are, I think, capture better than anything that I've ever read the romanticism of bohemian life in Greenwich Village in the early 1960s. I mean, that alone, historically, it makes that book worthwhile. So I love the writing. I love that he skips around in the time periods in the book. It's not linear in any way. In that way, it's like his songs. He goes from one point of view to another. So I'm actually going to teach that next week, and I'm going to be like dipping back into the book and rereading big sections of it. And so, I like it. I like it very much. Well, he's a great writer, and great. You can go see a famous writer at the at a conference anywhere in the world, and they will attract sometimes thousands of people to a venue. I think that he does the combination of being a great writer and a performer, particularly with music, because music touches parts of the brain that are particularly resonant and possibly addictive. It's that, and I think I realized when I was writing my book, Positively Main Street, that one of the reasons I focused upon myself in the book is that I was a typical fan, and I realized that I was not only a typical fan, but I was an hysterical fan, and that there was a certain pathology to being that obsessed with somebody. It was narcissistic in the sense that I needed somebody else to complete me. And I think that's a huge part of any kind of fandom, is that you so identify with this person that you idolize that you forget who you are, you devalue who you are, and you look to the other person to legitimize your existence. So, I see these people at the various Dylan concerts that I go to. I don't go to that many anymore. If he's someplace that I am, I'll go see him. But, like I was in Chile. I saw him in Santiago, Chile back in 2009 or something like that. And there was a woman sitting in the row in front of me who had been to 30 concerts that year. And she was following him around Latin America. She's spending her whole vacation following him around Latin America. She was an American woman. At State College, there was a woman in line in front of me who had driven down from Ontario, Canada, to see the show and was driving back that night. And she had seen something like 20 shows that year. So I think, it's any kind of hysteria along those lines morphs into pathology, fairly quickly. Yeah, I used that I put that as the quote. He said that in Rolling Stone in the fall of 1969, and Jan Wenner was really pressing him to say something negative about the Village Voice, and he kept asking Dylan to make a comment, and finally Dylan said that the only things that he didn't like about the article were that I mentioned his father, who had just died, and he said that he thought that I was sort of making fun of things in Hibbing, and kind of a hipper than thou fun making of these Middle Western people. And then he said, but that boy, this fella Toby, has got some lessons to learn. And I read that and I just thought, wow, I knew immediately that was going to be the quote at the beginning of my book. And so when I wrote the book, I knew that my character did learn lessons. There are two trips in the book. The first one, I went out and I was, looking for the roots of my hero and writing about the people of Hibbing in a little condescending way, making they weren't as hip as the people on the East Coast. When I came back, I realized the lessons that I learned in the second part of the book were that as a journalist, you do have a certain responsibility to people's feelings. It's not that you're going to, not tell what they told you or say what they told you, but that you treat them with respect. You don't make fun of them, particularly people who are not used to talking to reporters. So those were some of the lessons that I learned, and also that, as Dylan says in so many of his songs and writings, that all heroes have feet of clay, and you realize that about your heroes. You realize that about yourself. So, I mean, at age 23, I had many, many lessons to learn, and still do.